In the days when the judges ruled, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It was a time of rebellion, a time of chaos, and a time of frequent judgment. Yet in the middle of those dark days, the story of Ruth shines like a light. It is a story of love, loyalty, redemption, and the faithfulness of God. It is more than ancient history. It is a story that speaks directly into our lives today, reminding us of the God who turns sorrow into joy, emptiness into fullness, and despair into hope. The book begins with famine. The Bible says in Ruth 1:1, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were from Bethlehem, the very place whose name means house of bread. Yet in the house of bread, there was no bread. Hunger drove them to leave their homeland and settle in Moab, a foreign land, the land of Israel's enemies." You see, sometimes in our desperation, we are tempted to leave the place of God's promise in search of what looks easier. But whenever we run to the world for survival instead of trusting God's provision, we often find sorrow. Not long after they arrived in Moab, tragedy struck. The Bible says in Ruth 1:3, "Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Naomi buried her husband in a strange land. She had left Bethlehem full, but now she was already tasting emptiness. Her sons later married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. For 10 years they lived in Moab. But then sorrow struck again. Ruth 1:5 says, "Both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Naomi was crushed. She had buried her husband. She had buried both sons. She was left in a foreign land with 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, no provision and no hope." Life lesson: sin and sorrow often take us further than we thought we would go, keep us longer than we planned to stay, and cost us more than we ever thought we would pay. Naomi's story shows us the pain of loss, but also the beginning of God's redemption. In time, Naomi heard that the famine in Judah was over, that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. With nothing left in Moab, she rose to return home. Her daughters-in-law went with her, walking part of the way. But Naomi turned to them and said in Ruth 1:8-9, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." They wept aloud. Both women insisted they would stay with her. But Naomi told them she had nothing to give. Even if she married again that very night, even if she bore sons, would they wait until the boys grew up? It was hopeless. She cried out in Ruth 1:13, "It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." When we walk through deep sorrow, it is easy to believe God is against us. But often what looks like his hand of judgment is really the preparation for his greatest blessing. At that moment, Orpah kissed Naomi and went back, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi pleaded one last time, "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth gave one of the most powerful declarations of faith and loyalty ever spoken. Ruth 1:16-17 says, "But Ruth replied, 'Dawn to urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me.'" These were the words of a Moabite widow, a foreigner. She had nothing to gain by clinging to Naomi, yet she chose loyalty. She chose faith. She turned her back on Moab and its idols, and she embraced the God of Israel. True faith is not just words, it is costly loyalty. Ruth's decision teaches us that following God means leaving behind the old life, even when it costs us everything. So Naomi and Ruth traveled together until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived, the whole town was stirred. The women asked, "Can this be Naomi?" But Naomi replied in Ruth 1:20-21, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Naomi's name meant pleasant, but she said, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. She believed her story was over. She thought God had abandoned her. But she could not see that Ruth standing beside her was God's gift, God's plan, and God's redemption already in motion. The chapter closes in Ruth 1:22. So Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. The famine was over. The harvest had begun. And with it, the seeds of redemption were about to grow. Sometimes, when we think God has abandoned us, He is already preparing the harvest. Our emptiness is not the end of the story. It is the soil in which God grows His greatest blessings. Ruth and Naomi arrived in Bethlehem with nothing. No husband, no sons, no wealth, no security. But Ruth was determined to provide. So she asked Naomi for permission to go into the fields and glean. According to God's law, the poor were allowed to follow behind the reapers and gather leftover grain. It was backbreaking work, reserved for the lowest and the desperate. Yet Ruth humbled herself to do it. The Bible says in Ruth 2:3, "So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech." As it turned out? Those words may sound like coincidence, but they are divine providence. Ruth did not just stumble into any field. She walked into the exact field God had chosen, the field belonging to Boaz, a man who would play a crucial role in her redemption. What looks like coincidence in our lives is often God's providence. He orders our steps, even when we are unaware. Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted his workers. "The Lord be with you." They replied, "The Lord bless you." This tells us something important. Boaz was not just a wealthy man, he was a godly man. He noticed Ruth immediately. He asked the overseer, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer explained she was the Moabite who had returned with Naomi. He told Boaz how she had been working hard all day with little rest. Then Boaz went to Ruth and spoke words that must have startled her. Ruth 2:8-9 records, "So Boaz said to Ruth, 'My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled.'" Boaz not only noticed Ruth, he protected her, provided for her, and gave her dignity. In a world where a foreign widow could have been abused, ignored, or despised, Boaz treated her with kindness. Overwhelmed, Ruth bowed down and asked in Ruth 2:10, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied in Ruth 2:11-12, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." When we step out in faith and take refuge under God's wings, He notices. Even when the world overlooks us, God honors faithfulness, loyalty, and humility. At mealtime, Boaz invited Ruth to eat with him and his workers. He offered her bread and roasted grain until she was satisfied, and she even had leftovers to take home. Afterward, Boaz instructed his men to let her glean among the sheaves and even pull out stalks from the bundles and leave them for her. Boaz's kindness went beyond the law. He gave her abundance. That evening, Ruth threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah, over 30 pounds of grain. She carried it back to Naomi, along with the leftover food from her meal. Naomi was astonished. She asked, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth told her it was the field of Boaz. Naomi's eyes opened with hope. She said in Ruth 2:20, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." God is always working behind the scenes. What looks like a simple act of kindness is often the doorway to redemption. Day after day, Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's field until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. As the harvest ended, Naomi observed how Ruth had carried herself with dignity, humility, and faithfulness. She realized that Boaz had noticed the same qualities and that Providence had carefully orchestrated the steps leading them to this moment. Naomi spoke to Ruth one evening, instructing her to wash, anoint herself, and put on her best clothes. Then she was to go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be winnowing barley. Naomi advised Ruth to wait until Boaz had finished eating and drinking, and then to approach quietly, uncover his feet, and lie down. This was a bold, careful plan, designed to allow Ruth to place herself under Boaz's protection in accordance with the custom of redemption and the practice of Israel. Ruth followed her mother-in-law's instructions. She approached the threshing floor at night and quietly laid at Boaz's feet. Around midnight, Boaz awoke, startled to find a woman at his feet. When he asked who she was, Ruth spoke simply and clearly, explaining her intentions. Boaz responded with admiration for her courage, her loyalty, and her goodness, assuring her that she had acted in faith and in alignment with the right purpose. He explained that there was a closer kinsman who had the first right to redeem, but that he would take responsibility if the nearer relative declined. He praised Ruth for her integrity, and she returned home that night with a gift of barley, carrying the evidence of hope and care from the man who would play a central role in her life. The next morning, Boaz went to the town gate, where legal matters were customarily addressed, and called the nearer kinsman. In the presence of 10 elders, he presented the opportunity to redeem the land belonging to Naomi's late husband. The kinsman initially agreed, but then realized that redeeming the land also required marrying Ruth, the widow of the deceased. He declined, leaving the way open for Boaz to act. The transaction was formalized according to custom. The nearer kinsman handed Boaz his sandal, symbolizing the transfer of the right to redeem. Witnessed by the elders and the townspeople, the agreement was complete, and Boaz was free to take Ruth as his wife. Boaz went to Naomi and told her the matter was settled, that Ruth was his wife, and that God had made provision for their future. Ruth's loyalty, humility, and faithfulness had led her to protection and blessing. Their union produced a son named Obed, who became the grandfather of King David. Naomi's family was restored, and the lineage that would eventually lead to the Messiah was secured. The once desolate widow now had joy, provision, and continuity for her family. The story of Ruth demonstrates how loyalty, humility, and faith in God's provision create opportunities for redemption and blessing. Ruth left everything familiar, her home, her culture, and even her religion, to join Naomi and trust in the God of Israel. She worked diligently, trusted God's timing, and acted with courage when opportunity came. Boaz, a man of integrity and faith, noticed her character, acted with kindness, and obeyed the laws and customs that protected the vulnerable. The seemingly small acts of loyalty, diligence, and respect for God's ways ultimately led to extraordinary outcomes. Ruth's story also shows how God's providence works quietly and often invisibly. Nothing in her circumstances suggested immediate blessing. She faced widowhood, poverty, and exile. Yet God's hand guided her to the right place, introduced her to the right people, and orchestrated events in a way that fulfilled his larger plan. Naomi, who initially felt bitter and empty, witnessed the unfolding of God's care through the faithfulness of Ruth and the integrity of Boaz. What appeared hopeless became hope-filled, and what was empty was filled with new life. Through this story, we see that God can bring restoration from loss, purpose from pain, and blessing from loyalty and faith. God's plan often unfolds through ordinary actions, Ruth gleaning in the fields, speaking courageously and trusting God. Yet these simple acts are powerful in His hands. The redemption of Naomi's family, the protection of Ruth, and the rise of Obed all point to the greater story of God as faithfulness and the preparation for the coming of Christ, who would redeem the lost, bring restoration, and unite people from every nation. In the end, Ruth, the Moabitess, became a mother in Israel, a symbol of God's acceptance of those who turn to Him with faith, and a direct ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus Christ. Her story reminds us that trust, courage, and faithfulness matter. Leaving behind the familiar, serving faithfully, and walking in integrity can open doors that human eyes cannot yet see. Even in moments of despair, God is working, guiding, and orchestrating events for a greater purpose. Through her life, we understand that God honors faithfulness, values humility, and fulfills His promises through the careful alignment of human choice with divine providence. Thus, from famine, loss, and exile came loyalty, providence, and blessing. From widowhood came family, from foreignness came inclusion, and from fear came courage. The story of Ruth closes not with despair, but with hope, restoration, and the assurance that God works in every faithful heart to bring about redemption, legacy, and life beyond what the world can imagine.